Uh, Hello, everybody, and welcome to this open lecture at Ratio's YouTube channel. The topic today is open borders, which I find a very timely topic, especially as so many borders have been closed. With us today to introduce us to the topic of open borders, beginner and expert level, is Professor Fabio Rojas. He's a University of Chicago PhD, and since then a professor of sociology at Indiana University of Bloomington. His research interest is organizational behavior, social movements, higher education, rational choice, all kinds of cool stuff. Check him out. He's the author of many books. One of them is From Black Power to Black Studies. He also has a very nice theory book on theory titled Theory for the Working Sociologist from 2017, and numerous journal articles as well. He's also the co-editor of Context, which is an ASA journal, together with Rashawn Ray. He blogs. He has over 3,000 followers on Twitter. He's a very active guy. I'm getting to know. I know this from firsthand experience. And I'm very happy to introduce him to you here today. And with that, will give the word over to Fabio.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to thank everybody who's logging in, who's checking out the video. I know that we're in a time of public crisis and a serious health issue, so I understand that you may be under personal stress. So I very much appreciate the fact that you took the time out to be with us today. So the title of my talk is Open Borders, Beginner, Intermediate, and Expert Levels. And what I want to do in this talk today is to tell you what open borders is and explain it at kind of a very introductory level, then at a slightly more sophisticated level, and then the expert level is about social change. If you buy my argument and you believe in open borders, what should you do? So what is open borders? Well, open borders is pretty simple. Make migration legal. Remove barriers to migration, to movement. We would simplify the visa system or abolish it. There will be no deportations, no immigration camps, no places where we pick people up from work and take them to a prison because they didn't fill out the right paperwork. And you may say, this is a very counterintuitive position. Abolishing migration restrictions is highly unpopular. What's the intuition behind it? Why should you believe it? Well, the intuition is actually fairly simple, which is that it's okay to move. Every day in our lives, people move from neighborhood to neighborhood, town to town, state or province to other province, and things are okay, right? And so what I want to do today is I want to build up your intuition about why you should be more liberal towards migration. And so the beginner level open borders discussion is all about what do you say to somebody who you encounter on, say, Facebook or Twitter, or you're at home and your friends say something like, we should shut the borders and keep the immigrants out. What do you say to these people? That's the beginner level. And one thing that I'd like to tell you is a lot of these basic arguments are fairly easy to refute or to rebut. Some of them are simply biases in disguise, and some of them simply make no sense. So let me give you some examples. For example, a lot of people will say things like, those immigrants are lazy. That's a common thing I hear in the United States. They'll say, people from that country are very lazy. We shouldn't let them in. That's clearly biased. That's clearly form of prejudice, and you should dismiss it as such. When people say those people are criminals, they are all criminals from Poland or Mexico, whatever country you're pointing your finger at. You can just say, look, I don't buy arguments like that. You're going to have to do better with me. Some people will say immigrants want to come in and exploit our public services. Once again, that's a form of bias. Most people actually want to get jobs and lead normal lives. So you say, well, I don't really believe that. You're going to need more evidence. Then some people will say they're threatening our culture if they come to our country. And then you should just look at that person and say, look, cultures change. Most cultures reflect hundreds of years of change. American culture is not the same today as it was in 1900. Cultures change. So a lot of these very basic arguments you might find on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook are pretty easy to refute. Then there are other ideas that people offer informally that literally make no sense. For example, somebody will say, immigrants steal our jobs. But you don't own a job. Nobody owns a job. A job is a voluntary action between an employer and an employee. You don't own a job. You weren't born into it like a prince is born into a throne. So that argument really doesn't hold a lot of value on its face. Sometimes people will say things like a country is like a home. You wouldn't let everybody into your home. That's a very weird argument as well. Because if you want to restrict migration, you're telling people in other homes that they can't have people from Mexico in their house, that they can't have a guest or rent an apartment or rent a property to somebody from Mexico. So by restricting migration, you're actually violating other people's homes and their ability to open their homes to other people. So these kinds of arguments, even on their face, really don't make a lot of sense. And if you're at the dinner table and a relative says something like that, maybe you don't want to yell at them or argue with them over dinner, but maybe you could casually say, I don't buy that. I really don't think people own a job. You compete for them the way everybody else does. Another important thing to remember about open borders and migration at the introductory or beginner's level is that restriction policies or policies that restrict migration seriously harm people. I'm not exaggerating. This is often a underappreciated point about migration. So if you tell somebody you can't move from Syria because they're in a civil war, you're putting them in harm's way. You're literally taking a person who's running out of a burning house and pushing them back in. That directly harms them. Say somebody grows up in poverty. They're in a country with a dysfunctional economy and a bad political system. And you tell them they have to stay there, they're missing out on thousands of dollars in improved life. And I am talking about open borders during the time of the COVID epidemic. And already many of you appreciate this, that if you're forced to stay at home, you don't have a job, you're missing your families. This may be a short-term issue, but imagine that you were forced to stay in your country, away from jobs, away from your friends, not for a couple of months or a couple of weeks, but for years or even decades. So that directly harms people. Families are split up by migration restrictions. For example, say that you live in Mexico and your father goes to work in agriculture in California. And then he's afraid to come back because if he comes back, he may not be able to get back to California to make that money to support your family. So that means your father has to stay away from you while you grow up. This is another problem with migration restrictions. They end up destroying families and tearing them apart. And then finally, last but not least, by restricting migration, you are depriving natives of a country from all the benefits they get from interacting with migrants. For example, you may want to hire a migrant to clean your house. Your doctor may be an immigrant. Your teacher may be an immigrant. The person you marry may be an immigrant. These are all excellent things in life. And by restricting migration, you're hurting those people. So when somebody casually at the dinner table says, I want to restrict migration, I want to close the borders, you have to say those policies directly harm a lot of people. And if you want to persuade me that we should restrict migration, you have to show me there's an overwhelming problem with migration that balances out all the harm done to migrants. So just to summarize the point here, when you're talking with people casually on the street, in the classroom, or at work, and people say anti-immigrant things, just gently remind them or remind yourself that some of these arguments are simply bias or they're prejudices. Some ideas make no sense, and these policies directly harm people. Restricting migration directly harms billions of people. So for me to be persuaded that we should restrict migration, you have to show me overwhelming evidence that migration is bad. And this leads to the more advanced arguments about open borders. So you may be listening to this video and you may say, well, Fabio, I already appreciate these things. I'm not really worried about migration because I think they're all criminals. That's silly. I'm not a biased person, but I'm really concerned about some other issues. I'm concerned about crime. I'm concerned about the economy. I'm concerned about public services. And people make more well-intentioned arguments that require some thought. And the intermediate level of open borders argument is simply that when you look at the evidence these particular issues, usually migration comes out in a pretty positive light. And this is not a case where experts are divided and you go to Department of Economics or sociology or public policy, and people are bitterly divided about what the right policy is. To the contrary, most researchers who look into immigration and offer very strong evidence on it usually come to the conclusion in most cases that migration simply isn't that big of a problem. And there are some negative effects here and there, but for the most part, these are fairly small compared to all the benefits of migration. And it's small compared to allowing millions, maybe billions of people from improving their lives. So usually when people offer these more sophisticated arguments, they usually offer them in utilitarian terms. What does that mean? Well, utilitarian argument simply says, come up with a metric or a measurement of how well people are. And then you say, if we do the policy on the average, does that make people better off or does it make people worse off? Right? So this is a utilitarian argument. So for example, people may say, well, I know that, immigrants aren't lazy, of course, they're normal human beings who want jobs, but if we let a bunch of them in, won't that make some people unemployed? Maybe some of them are criminals, and it's true, like in the same way that not everybody's a criminal, not everybody's a nice person. And you can offer these arguments that talk about the well-being of the community, and you could say, does allowing immigrants into your community increase the well-being of our community, or does it make it worse, right? Sometimes some of these arguments are very sophisticated. For example, they'll even say things like, even the country that sends immigrants may be harmed. That's called the brain drain argument, where they say if all the smart people, all the good people from a poor country move to a wealthy country, isn't that bad? So if you examine the evidence and you think about the underlying logic of each of these arguments, you realize that most utilitarian arguments against immigration really don't stand up to scrutiny. So now I want to give you an example of a few arguments that you're likely to encounter. They're a little bit more sophisticated. And I want to talk about some of the evidence about them and talk about why the pro-migration side or the open border side comes out looking pretty good. For example, the number one thing that people mention is jobs. So people will say, look, isn't it true in Econ 101 or Principles of Economics that the more of a product you allow into a market, the lower the price goes? So if we have more television sets, the price of TVs will go down. Labor is not exempt from this. Labor is not a special product that exists in a different economic universe. If you allow all these migrants to come in, won't that push wages down and increase unemployment? And for many years, some economists thought this. And then starting in the 1980s, economists like David Card started doing studies asking the question, what evidence do we have that migration actually does decrease wages and increase unemployment? And what he found, and what most labor economists find, is that an increase in migration to a particular town or region or city usually does not lead to massive unemployment. In fact, in most studies, they're usually null effects, which means that when you have more migrants coming in, you don't see that much of a change in wages. You don't see that much of a change in terms of unemployment. And then the one exception of this, which is commonly discussed, is a paper by George Borjas, a professor of economics at Harvard, who says he found evidence that there is an unemployment negative effect. And if you read his own paper, which I recommend that all of you do, read his textbook, read his paper, you will actually discover, if you look at the tables, that when he studied the Mariel boat lift, which is when Cuban migrants were all of a sudden moved from Cuba into Miami, and he asked the question, does that make people employed or unemployed? Does that increase or decrease wages? And what he discovers is that for most people, there's no effect. So all these Cubans came in, thousands upon thousands of refugees were suddenly moved into Cuba by the Castro regime, and there was really no effect. However, he did find a small negative effect for people with only a high school education. So it is there in the data. It's a small effect, but there, I think this speaks well to the open borders position and explains a little bit why open borders is an intuitive thing. First of all, when migrants come into a new economy, they don't just compete for labor. They also buy food, they buy housing, medical care, all kinds of products and services. So unlike a television set, They also want to bid up the price of services and goods. This is one reason there's not massive unemployment when immigrants come in, because they're also buying things and spending money and building wealth. Another thing that's been discovered by labor economists is that most migrants who come in do not directly compete with natives. It is true that migrants will tend to compete with unskilled or low-skilled natives, but that is a small slice of the population. That's not something to brush off lightly. We really do care about the well-being of everybody. But if you were to tell me we can get people out of Cuba, away from a communist regime, which has all kinds of very serious problems, and the price of that, relatively speaking, was that statistically a few people have a little bit less money to spend. If you look at George Borjas's paper, he estimated that high school graduates made $800 less per year when they were competing with migrants. I would say that's a small price to pay. You know, $800 a year in 1980 was the price of a very nice TV set. I would not send somebody back to Cuba or a communist regime over a television set. So what these studies in labor economics tend to show is that there isn't that big of a difference in labor markets before and after migration. The second thing I want to talk about is crime. This is an extremely popular argument. So one of the arguments that people have is, well, maybe not all immigrants are criminals, but maybe some of them are. And if we let people in who are migrants, who are from another country, then they might increase the crime rate. Well, once again, this is something that maybe in your mind might be, or theoretically may be possible, but in study after study, it turns out that almost all studies, the vast overwhelming majority of them, find that people who are natives actually have a higher crime rate. They're more likely to commit crimes than immigrants. And you may be scratching your head, and you may be asking, how do we know this? Why is that true? So for example, Alex Naraste, an economist, and Michelangelo Landgrave, they recently released a paper where they downloaded the American Community Survey, which is a survey of residents of the United States, and they asked them, have you ever been incarcerated, or are you currently, or somebody in your household currently incarcerated? And the incarceration rate for natives was way higher than immigrants. And you may say, why is that the case? Well, the answer is self-selection. So self-selection simply means that somebody who participates in an activity is not random. They have a certain trait which makes it easier for them to participate. So if you want to be an immigrant, that's not a random act. The random person in a country would probably find it very hard to be an immigrant, to move to another country. Somebody who immigrates from another country has to save up the money for travel, for housing. They have to learn the language, if it's a new language. They have to learn the customs. They have to learn the legal system. So in other words, these are all screens for people, and they tend to yield people with more aptitude and more energy, and people who are more willing to live by the standards of society. Another really nice example of research comes from the journal I edit. Before I was an editor of Context Magazine, we ran an article by Robert Sampson, who's a professor of sociology at Harvard University, and he did a study of Chicago neighborhoods. And he said, which neighborhoods have high crime and low crime, right? And the first thing you have to do is you have to separate neighborhoods where people are wealthy from neighborhoods where people are not wealthy. And he discovered that amongst the wealthy neighborhoods, there isn't much of a difference. If you are in a wealthy neighborhood with immigrants, it looks pretty much the same in terms of crime as other neighborhoods. But in low-income neighborhoods, there's a very clear relationship between immigration and lower crime. So if you have more immigrants in your neighborhood and you're a low-income neighborhood, you tend to have a very much lower level of crime. And these sorts of studies are actually fairly common. Immigrants, they're as a proportion of their population, they're less likely to commit crimes, they're less likely to be in jail. The places where they live tend to have less crime. A third kind of utilitarian argument is that people may come and vote the wrong way. People will say, well, if we let in immigrants, they'll all turn us into radical Islamists, or they'll turn us all into Stalinists or something like that. And that's not a true argument. In studies or data sets that we have where we survey people about their opinions on public policy, we find that immigrants tend to be actually very close to the average voter in terms of many policy issues. So, for example, it's not the case that everybody's going to come in and vote for the Communist Party. That's clearly not true. For example, in the US, most immigrants tend to be slightly liberal Democrats. That's not really that different from the rest of society. And some immigrant groups actually tend to be very conservative, like Cubans, for example, or Vietnamese tend to be more conservative. So when it comes to these issues like jobs, do they take our jobs? The answer is no. They actually provide goods and services. Do they commit crime less? The answer is no, they don't. In terms of their policy issues, will they come in and vote one way or the other way? The answer is they're not that different than natives on most issues. On a couple issues, they're a little bit different, but they're not that much different. So you may say, okay, well, I'm not a utilitarian. I don't judge everything just based on measurable outcomes and consequences. There must be an ethical reason or a theoretical reason to restrict migration. And my argument, actually, there isn't. Why? So here's my argument. You tell me what your ethical perspective is, and I will argue to you that the most consistent position with your ethical framework is an open borders position. Let me give you a few examples. So, for example, if you're classically liberal or libertarian, and I would say the default position or the presumption of your political philosophy is to allow people to do what they want, long as they're nonviolent. So migration is clearly nonviolent. We shouldn't stop it. Say you're progressive, you're left-wing progressive. One of your big issues is inequality. You may say, Fabio, I'm not libertarian, I'm really progressive, I really care about inequality. Well, the biggest inequality on planet Earth is the difference between people who live in industrialized countries with functional economies and functional political systems compared to the rest of the world. And one of the easiest ways to close the gap between the world's wealthiest people and the poorest people is to give them a ticket, an airline ticket, and move them to a wealthier country. This is way easier than most policies of redistribution. I've shown you the empirical evidence. When people move to new countries, they make a lot more money, they live better lives. This is a very easy policy in terms of the technical side. It's very easy to simply say, we'll just relax the restrictions, let people move. So if you truly care about the world's poor and decreasing the gap between the wealthy and the poor, open borders is your best bet. Let's say you're conservative, you're traditionalist, a social traditionalist. Then migration is a great example of self-reliance, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Let people decide whether they want to move, and if they want to make a better life for themselves, they'll make the effort, they'll get the money, the funds, and they'll organize themselves and move to a better place. If you're a traditionalist and you believe in family values and keeping families intact, then you want a regime of open labor movement, so people don't have to be split up. So if your father moves from Mexico to California to work for 6 months, gathering tomatoes or lettuce or whatever crop, they can come back. Or if somebody moves to the California and they have a family in California, their father or their parent doesn't get deported and the child is left behind. So if you truly value families, you would advocate flexible, open migration regimes where it's easy to move back and forth between countries. Or what if you're a socialist? What if you're a far left kind of socialist person and you say, Fabio, I don't believe in markets. I think they're really bad. What's the argument for me? I would say it's pretty simple, which is if you really think about worker solidarity as being very important and being a resource for making our societies more fair, then let the workers coordinate with each other and be together with each other and increase a regime of movement. So the most advanced level of the open borders argument is policy and social change. And I'm very optimistic about open borders. I think logic is on my side, and I think evidence is on my side. But you quickly realize that you're in a small fringe minority. If you look at surveys in most countries and you ask the question, should we allow more immigration or less, the average voter will actually say less. And if you ask people, should we reduce the number of immigrants, that number is surprisingly high. And it goes up and down. It's been a little bit more in my favor in recent years, but safe to say that most Americans do not agree with this position. It's probably also true that most people in the EU do not agree with this position. So what do you do? What do you do if you're in the small minority of a position that you're pretty persuaded is a good position? What do you do with the rest of society? Well, there's a couple of strategies I would recommend. One is simply outreach. And one of my beliefs about how social change operates is that public opinion matters. If you think about social change and think about how it happens, public opinion is like the wind in the sail of a ship. You can either move with the wind or you can move against the wind. And if you're moving against the wind, it's very hard to make progress. It's possible, it's just very hard. So one thing that you can do is you can actually try to change public opinion around your issue. And in my lifetime, we've seen lots of great examples of that. For example, when I was a child in the 20th century, a long time ago, in the 1970s and 80s, gay rights was simply not an issue for most people. However, now we recognize that people who are not straight deserve the same rights and privileges as everybody else. And that was a very difficult struggle that happened over 30 or 40 years. So there have been lots of examples where opinions that were once considered unusual, strange, or counterintuitive finally seized the day. And they did by slowly persuading people one at a time through dinner table discussions, podcasts, YouTube videos, educational seminars, that you have a valid point to make. A second way to change society is through politics. And for better or worse, we live in a world where states tell us where we can move and not move, and they govern our lives. And people may be skeptical, but democratic states do actually respond to voters. They do respond to people, however, imperfectly. So for example, if you're a local representative to Parliament, or in my case, the United States Congress, if they say something that is very anti-immigrant, write them a letter and tell them you disagree. You don't have to be angry about it. You don't have to call them names, but write that letter. And one thing that you learn is that maybe one letter doesn't matter too much, but 1,000 letters matters a lot. And a lot of offices in the United States will actually keep track of letters, and they actually have very sophisticated systems tracking phone calls, emails, tweets, and letters. So it's imperfect, but the system does actually listen in its own very, very slow way. Some people might also recommend protest and civil disobedience. And I think given the cruelty of a lot of migration restriction, this is an option that may be on the table for some people. And so, for example, in the US, there are walkouts, there are street protests. Some people have actually directly intervened in deportations, like to put themselves physically between immigration control and a family that's about to be arrested or deported, and to somehow, create controversy and attract attention to the plight of immigrants, because many of them are mistreated when they're picked up and put in jail. So that's also another form of politics that's worth thinking about. Then finally, there's policy, right? So all the time we are confronted with policy choices. Should we do this? Should we do that? Should we do this? Should we do that? So for example, in the time of COVID, which is when we're recording this YouTube podcast, people are saying, let's close the borders. And I say, oh, well, let's slow down. Maybe we need safe travel. Maybe we should exercise some caution with quarantines. So we still have to let people move, right? Other examples could be the DREAM Act, which was a popular piece of legislation in the US a couple of years ago, which made it easier for people who are born in the US, but they're not citizens, to stay. That is a far step from the ideal that I advocate, but it's worth talking about. And similarly, I would just say, whenever policy comes up in your town or your province or state, write a letter to your representative, write a note to the newspaper, or even tell people at work that, I don't think they should be rounding up immigrants and taking them from work in my town. And so the final kind of thought I want to leave you with is that somebody who's for open borders like I am, and hopefully maybe one day you'll be for open borders, that we are like the abolitionists of old. Somebody who's for open borders today has a vision. We see a world where there are no police picking up parents after work and putting them in immigrant detention centers. I want to dream of a world where if somebody's in a poor country, they can say, I can move to another better country and get a nice job and not be persecuted. I want to see a world of global movement where people can escape the worst circumstances and lead happier, productive lives in other places. But most of the world doesn't believe in that. So we are in the same position that St. Abolitionist was in 1830, when they looked at slavery and people said, slavery will always be with us. It's natural. The answer is it's not. There's nothing natural about slavery, about racial domination. The same thing is true with migration restriction. There's nothing natural normal about it. It is created by human beings and people. So what I urge the listener to do is to feel confident that morally you're on the right side if you're for migration, for free and liberal migration. Scientifically, in terms of the evidence we have, the benefits of migration seem to vastly outweigh the negative side effects. And combined, that should give you a little bit of confidence to say, even though this position is unpopular or on the fringe, that is worth fighting for. So I just want to say thank you to Charlotta Stern, Carl Wenberg, who will discuss with us, Henrik Olvarsson, and the Ratio Institute for sponsoring this talk. Originally, I was supposed to be in Stockholm in person recording this, and that would have been supported by the Institute for Humane Studies and a travel fellowship. I want to thank the Ratio Institute's donors. I'm sure they must have supporters who help them out financially to make sure things work. And I want to thank everybody who's logging in today. And even if you don't agree with me, that's okay. I thank you for at least taking the time to consider these ideas.
Fabio, thank you so much for that presentation. I think we all had our shares of new thoughts, and I am very happy to hear you sort of make a very strong argument, I feel, for why open borders is a good position to hold. So with that, I am going to ask Carl Wenberg to give some comments. Carl is also a professor, although in business administration at Linköping University. He's an associate here at Ratio and has done some stuff and studied immigration in the Swedish context. And so I think he can get into more of the good, bad, what does it, what's the empirical picture like in Sweden? And I think that could be like a very fruitful ground for discussion. So with that, I hand over the microphone to Carl.
Thank you so very much, Lotta, and thank you, Fabio, for that excellent speech. I certainly learned a lot, and I think all the other listeners did as well. So I would like to pose a few questions to you, Fabio, and start out with the sort of Swedish-American comparison, which both of you were getting into. I think in Sweden, we've seen more of a rapid change in migration and also people's attitude to migration compared to, say, a very multicultural country such as the United States. And I think that change that we've seen is interesting and sometimes a bit fearful, because I think that the experience within American townships, regions, states of adapting to global and regional migration is vastly longer, not least since much of American heritage is created by migration, as opposed to Swedish heritage, at least for the last couple of years or so. And two recent books I read actually get into this picture. So I thought I'll just showcase you an example of the book, and I may send one of them over to you, Fabio, since you weren't able to come here. And the first is a book called Swede Hollow. Can you all see these pictures?
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah, so if you haven't seen the book to the left, Fabio, I will send you a copy. And it's a brilliant piece of historical journalism of a Swedish writer who looks into the archives of how it was to be a Swedish migrant to Minnesota back at the former turn of the century, and also how the Scandinavians, in particular the Swedes, who were kind of most down the social ladder compared to the somewhat richer Danes and Norwegians, congregated in sort of ghettos, which were no-go zones for proper Americans, and they tried to get jobs. Often these were short-term jobs, jobs at the lower end of the economic ladder. They had difficulties. They were speaking odd languages. People thought that they smelled. They ate strange fish. And it's both kind of amusing, but also kind of scary to read this book and realize that your neighbors, maybe even family members, students, friends, sometimes talks about, contemporary migrants in just similar terms. and with similar prejudices. So Swedes as well as Americans all have experienced migration in some part of their generation, maybe grandfathers, grandmothers, or farther back, which is often, I think, forgotten as we grapple with migration of today. So my first question to you, Fabio, is how do you think the American discourse and the talk around the dining tables and in the academic halls have changed, or hasn't it, regarding migration in the last 10 years or so? Because in Sweden, it has changed dramatically, and I think often not for the good.
Yeah, so that's a great example that you bring up, because you started your commentary by saying in Sweden we have a different experience of migration than America, which is absolutely true. But the irony is that we learned to love immigrants in America because of Swedes. So, so many of my neighbors here in the Midwest, as you mentioned, Minnesota, but Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Illinois, these are all populated by people from Northern Europe and specifically Scandinavia. And then you raised the question of how does our informal culture, our dinner table conversations change over time? So first of all, one interesting thing about United States history is that there's always been a suspicion of immigrants, even by the first wave of immigrants. So people always feel suspicious of outsiders. I don't think America is unique in this respect. Most communities do feel a little strange about people who may have a new language or they have a different look or something. So in that way, America is very similar, probably to every community ever to exist on this earth. But what's different about America is that sometime in the late 18th and early 19th century, there was kind of a political or elite consensus that migration should not be restricted. Ilya Somin at the George Mason Law School, for example, has a number of interesting law school review pieces that describe policy papers and white papers where he describes this, where still, at the time of the revolution in the US and the early American Republic period, there were lots of people who wanted to restrict migration. We even had a major political party called the Know Nothing Party. That was their nickname because they were anti-immigrant, but when you asked them about it, they would say, I know nothing. So they're kind of prejudiced, but didn't want to say it in public. However, why did migration restrictions not appear until the late 19th century and early 20th century? The reason is there was a short term, for maybe about 100 years, from the revolution up until maybe about the 1880s or so, a consensus amongst lawyers, politicians, judges, that the Constitution really didn't allow a lot of migration restrictions. And so that was an interesting thing where in the US, maybe the dinner table talk was, often anti-immigrant, but the elite opinion was against that. Then that changed in the late 1800s, and then you see fluctuations in it. So for example, maybe the 1960s, we saw liberalization both of everyday culture and of public policy, where in the 1960s, migration was liberalized again. And then that allowed my parents, for example, to come to New York City and to restart their lives. I think that's a great story. But then it changes again, where dinner table talk has become a little bit more negative in the US. It's a little bit more acceptable to say anti-immigrant things or kind of to disguise it and say, I want immigration, but only legal immigration. Some of the more vitriolic aspects of anti-immigration sentiment express themselves. So for example, there's been a rash on college campuses where you'll find a poster that says, call the police if you see illegal immigrants. So there's actually calls to have people harass other people by calling the police on them. Then, of course, our political elites have probably moved a little bit more to anti-immigration direction. Personally, I think Donald Trump is really an outlier, but he does represent a tendency where a lot of people are a little bit more suspicious of immigration than they used to be. But in some public opinion data, you even see some people moving in a pro-immigration direction. So it's a complicated story in the US about the everyday suspicion of outsiders, which is probably constant in life. But then in the US, our political leaders and our cultural leaders will be at certain times more open to immigration and allows for more openness and a more liberal regime.
So I think that's a great comment, and also kind of interesting to hear that sometimes the professionals in a society who kind of guards and interprets the founding constitution or the laws of a country needs to and can actually take a more long-term view, maybe across generations rather than what's the case for themselves right here, right now, compared to how we tend to reason in everyday life. So that's kind of interesting, and I guess at least that's what I hope that my elected politicians are doing. The second question I'd like to pose to you, Fabio, relates to an academic discourse that I personally found a bit more tricky. I think everyone agrees with your statement that we really would or should forego our new TV set if we can save lives, and if people are coming and fleeing on boats or over the borders. Having a little bit of more competition in specific pockets of the labor market may actually do us good. I for sure can testify that it will do us good as academics, but also in other sectors, of course. But the Oxford economist Paul Collier, who I know that you read and that you heard, often talks about migration as brain drain. So not the problem of poor people competing with other poor people, but rather the problem of villages and families saving up for college education for one person in the whole family or one person in the whole village. And then that person goes to Oxford or to New York University and basically stays there because it's a much more enjoyable life. And in a way, abandons the investments made by many people in his or her education to become a doctor or a dentist or something. And there is no doctor or dentist in that village for many, maybe years. That type of argument I find personally more hard to deal with when it comes to the potential negative side effects of large migration flows.
Yeah, so you raised the case of brain drain, and I usually have two responses to the brain drain criticism. First of all, if we really are liberal in the broad sense, and really believe that we do not exist just to serve others or as an instrument to serve other people's needs and goals, then it's okay if people move to a new place and don't come back. It may be a little bit bitter for the people who stay behind, but we don't own them. We don't own them. If it happens within a country, so for example, I can tell you in the Midwest of the United States, it's very common for people to come from small towns. They go to college, and then they move to New York City or they move to Chicago, and then we say that's okay. That's totally okay. It doesn't become any different because your family is in Vietnam or Kenya. What happens in downstate Illinois is maybe regrettable in some ways, but we don't own that person. They're allowed to author their own lives. But secondly, we could ask empirically, is it actually true that economies and societies are wrecked by all this brain drain? Well, the answer is actually more complicated than the brain drain critics often permit. So let me give you a hypothetical example, which is very similar to actually a lot of real world cases. Say you grow up in a poor place and your family saves up, as you pointed out, to send you to a college in the United States. You move, and then what happens is after you move and you get that nice job as a dentist or a doctor, you start sending money back. So that's the first thing that happens. You start sending money back. And then the second thing that often happens is that people who migrate to the wealthier countries, maybe later in their life, move back to their home country. So for example, my family, my extended family, some people have done that. They have moved back to the country where they came from, and then they have their retirement savings, and they buy a house, they hire landscapers, or they buy a television set, and there's a circulation of people and money between countries, which really helps people. So I'm not the kind of person to say that immigration never has any negative effect. I think that's a very intellectually dishonest opinion. But what I would say is, first, you don't own people that get to move where they want to move. But number two, there's probably a negative effect, but it's probably not as bad as you think. There's all that money and remittances that come back. People then come back to upgrade. They have their retirement, or they saved up money during their career and they can spend it back in the home country. And also when they come back, they bring their skills, right? So one thing that you discover in the study of migration, especially the sociological study of migration, is looking at all these patterns, where it's not that people just move and they stay. They may move for, say, 20 years and then come back, or they rotate between a number of cities or regions and then they come back. The border between Mexico and California is a really great example of this, where people say, look at all those Mexicans, they'll all come to the US. The answer is they're sort of true, but they only come for 6 months. They come, they earn their money, and they go back to their small town in Mexico. So the kind of case that Paul Collier is talking about that you raised is certainly important, is not to be brushed off. But once you look at the bigger picture and you get some data on what immigrants actually do, it's not really that bad of a problem.
I think that was a great reply, and also some insights in how we can kind of think about problematizing this black and white picture of the benefits and costs for migration, and you know, for whom, right? So we have the short term and the long term view. I have a couple of other questions, but I thought this is the time to bring in Lotta, who conjured this meeting. You have been moving across countries. You have personal experiences of this.
Yes, I have also a personal stake in open borders, to say the least. Anyway, I really appreciate your sort of principled statement, Fabio. But let me come back to you and ask you about some of the reflections and some of the, I think, problems that I find among people when we talk about open borders and free migration. And that's not so much, I think, at least not in my bubble or in my social setting, it's not so much about, oh, they're going to take our jobs, as much as it is they're never getting a job. So I think that the situation typically in Sweden has been that, you know, we have a real insider-outsider problem in our labor market, where immigrants have a very hard time landing their first job. And so it takes a long time for them to be self-supported. How do you suggest I talk about that with my fellows?
Right, and so that speaks to multiple issues. One issue is what's a more accurate description of immigrants? People who come and sit, or people who look for work? That's issue number one. And then number two, what are the specifics about the Swedish or Scandinavian labor markets that may make it hard for people to find a job? So let's start with the American example. Obviously, some occupations are highly regulated. You can't come in and do brain surgery or heart surgery. Maybe that's a good thing, just not having people rip open skulls randomly. But in general, most other labor markets are pretty easy to get into. So for example, a very common experience for migrants is to simply work in, say, food preparation. So for example, when I was a younger man without gray hair, I used to work in restaurants. And I noticed a lot of my colleagues washing dishes and scrubbing tables were Puerto Rican, because I lived on the East Coast. A lot of Puerto Rican guys would come in and they need to make money. And so that was easy. There is no, as part of the United States, there is no migration restriction between Puerto Rico and the rest of the United States. So over a couple of decades, millions of Puerto Ricans just moved from Puerto Rico to various parts of the US. And they have a very common trajectory. Some of them are doctors and lawyers, but most of them are not. They start off mowing lawns, cleaning houses, and working in restaurants with me. And that's a very easy job. They literally walk up to a restaurant and say, "Sir, do you have any work?" And the answer is either yes or no, and they just continue on. So you have to ask, what is it about Sweden that would make it hard for people to get entry-level jobs? And are such restrictions to labor justified? Are they good? And so then I would ask, well, what if we maybe liberalize labor markets, at least at these entry levels? That could be a good starting point, where you say, okay, what is about Sweden that prevents a person from washing dishes? Surely that is not a dangerous activity. That could be deregulated. There is no problem with people washing dishes or mowing lawns. And once people do that, then they start a pretty good, honest lifestyle. And most people who immigrate, honestly, they just want to work. Like if you look at the most popular reasons for movement, not only between countries, but within countries, the number one reason when you survey people is I was looking for a job, or I moved because I was offered a job. So what I would say in terms of Sweden, asked a very good question. Why is it that immigrants can get dishwashing jobs in New York City, but they can't get a dishwashing job in Sweden? Why is that? Mm-hmm. And that's where I would start the discussion, say, that's what I really care about. I want to make it easier for somebody to wash windows, wash dishes, so they can get a good labor history or work history, and then they can make better money later in their lives.
Well, thank you. I will use that in my next encounter.
Excellent.
I have a follow-up, or if you want to intersperse, Carl, just make some kind of. Otherwise, I'll keep asking questions, because I have another sort of personal experience in sort of among people who are not prejudiced, biased, but they show concern, and I'll tell you what they're concerned about. So they say, we have all these immigrants coming from religious, traditional, undemocratic, illiberal countries. They move to Stockholm or Sweden. They congregate in suburbs where a majority of the inhabitants might come from the same kind of traditional, religious, illiberal societies. That is scary. So if you understand what I mean, it's basically like a more of a cultural threat. I mean, if you're a sociologist. So how do you think about that? Those kinds of sort of social cleavages, I guess, or
Right. Yeah. So when I think about that particular issue, I start with one of my favorite places in the world. It's a town called Dearborn, Michigan.
All right.
Dearborn, Michigan is next to Detroit, and Dearborn is famous for having a lot of immigrants from very illiberal countries in the Middle East, Iraq, Yemen, countries where honestly I would probably disagree with a lot of their policies as being very anti-liberal. However, when I go to Dearborn, Michigan, people are nice to me. People are okay towards me. I go to the restaurants and they serve me the same food that they serve everybody else.
Sure.
Some of my favorite cafes and restaurants are in Dearborn, Michigan. Yet we have concentrations of people from those countries and neighborhoods. But what's the difference? The difference is that they're now in a country that has functional institutions, that I think has a more functional set of political behaviors. And most people will adjust to that very well. Now, let's extrapolate from the case of Dearborn, Michigan, and say, okay, maybe Dearborn, Michigan is unusual. It's an unusually wealthy suburb of Detroit, but it's not alone. There are lots of places. There are Chinatowns. In the East Coast, we used to have German towns, and those German migrants came from a Germany that was not the Germany of today. And yet those communities and neighborhoods are very comfortable, nice places to live. And they're not setting up Stalinism or communism or whatever in those neighborhoods. What happened? Well, the answer is that most people adjust to the country that they're living in. That's the answer. And we can see this in a number of ways. So for example, here's a very simple one. Something like 90% of second generation immigrants will learn the new language. So for example, you might say, well, I'm really worried about the culture. Can't they speak English? The answer is they will speak English, and almost all of them do. And if you don't believe me, turn on the TV or turn on the radio. And yeah, there's a Spanish language station in America. There are many of them actually. But you know what the advertisements are for? English lessons. Most immigrants are desperate to learn English because they want to blend in. They want to get that job. They want to look cool. They want to learn English. In the same way that somebody moves to Stockholm, they're going to learn Swedish. And then the number is nearly 100% for third generation immigrants. So, a good majority of people learn the language in the first generation because they have to survive. Almost 90% of people plus they learn in the second generation. And by the third generation, they speak the same language. And then in terms of, say, voting, right? So you're like, well, what if they come from illiberal countries? Then we can measure that. So, the politics of Iraq have not been brought to Dearborn. They just haven't. Like, they had the choice. They've been able to elect all kinds of people, but they tend to, elect people who are very similar to Western politicians as their city council leaders. So when it comes to that issue, what I say, if you're really worried about liberal attitudes or you're worried about crime or political violence like terrorism, there's a simple solution. Move them to America and give them cable TV and they'll become good Americans. Not always, but most of the time you'll be happy with the results.
Cable TV, that is. That's the answer.
Or Netflix. Give them Netflix.
Or Netflix.
Move them to Michigan and say, watch all the Netflix you want. I guarantee they'll be very nice neighbors to you after that.
So you talked a little bit about sort of the ethical argument for open borders. You talked about the economic argument for open borders, and you touched upon the social cultural argument. But could you just expand a little bit about sort of the benefits of migration in terms of enriching the culture?
Oh, right. Yeah. So,
you sort of talked about Dearborn, however. I mean,
right.
That
so
might
Dearborn is a great example.
Yeah.
So, immigrants, first of all, it's more people, and more people is usually a good thing. That most people don't appreciate that fact. But societies which are larger tend to produce more cultural things, right? So this is why New York City is one of the greatest places in the world. They have so many people, and that leads to theater and restaurants and bookstores and plays and art galleries and museums. And so when you bring more people in, you bring more resources and more of an ability to produce culture, right? Another big difference is entrepreneurship. That a lot of immigrants are entrepreneurs because they don't have access to the best jobs often. So for example, if you want to become a medical doctor in the US, you need 4 years of undergraduate training plus graduate training plus residency. Some immigrants can do that, but most immigrants can't. So they go into other areas, right? And, my gosh, just look around you and you'll see all kinds of companies and corporations founded by immigrants or children of immigrants, like Google was co-founded by Sergey Brin, who I think was is either Russian or the child of a Russian immigrant. Steve Jobs, who came from a family from Syria before he was adopted by his American family. And these are not isolated examples. It could be the person running the gas station. And you may need to take a trip to the grocery store in the middle of the night, and there may be a Mexican immigrant stocking the grocery store, or they may have a late night business, they can stop for coffee or something. And you say, thank God there's something open this late at night. Well, you can thank immigrants for that, right? Who delivers food on Christmas Day in America? Chinese restaurants, right? And some of these examples are small, but some of them are big. And our culture is incredibly enriched by all these entrepreneurs who come across. They also contribute to the arts. They contribute to our language. For example, just to give you a small sense of how immigration impacts culture, my son has a pair of pajamas with dinosaurs on it, but it says dinosaurs eat tacos. So it combines the traditional interest in tacos with immigration, with Mexican food. That's a small example. But think about all the ways, a sushi bar. You might like sushi. You might need to go to the gas station. Your teacher tells you something interesting about music or a TV series in another country in your classroom. Think about all the ways that culturally we are enriched by that culture. And that doesn't mean that you forget your old culture. What it means is you have more stuff you can choose from and more combinations of things to think about. And that's how cultures develop and become better over time.
Well, thank you so much for that. Carl, do you have any last thoughts or questions?
I had some on the back of my mind, but I think that last statement that Professor Rojas made was a really, really great one. And that's something I think that is perfect for rounding up of this discussion.
I kind of felt the same way. I really want to thank you again, Fabio, for doing this with us. I am very happy to be part of spreading sort of a positive message about open borders and about, just the arguments for open borders, even though it's tough and difficult and complicated and all the stuff we all know about. It is an argument worth repeating, I think. So, Fabio, let me ask you a final thing. Where do we turn if we want to read about your opinions on these matters?
Yeah, so Eon Ideas was a British website, which I think actually published an article I wrote about open borders. They're revising the website so it may not be accessible anymore.
Sure.
I've done multiple podcasts, for example, in addition to this discussion, for example, for Vox.
Mm-hmm.
I did a short, like 7-minute podcast explaining what open borders is. I was on the Lawrence Jones TV show on Fox News in the United States a couple of months ago. So if you want to see more kind of more conversational talk show format version of this, I have a personal blog where I often write about open borders. It's called orgtheory.net. It's an academic blog. But if you just go to the search engine and type in open borders, you can see my opinions. So for example, during the COVID epidemic, I tell people, don't shut down the borders, make safe borders. Like if you want to quarantine people, that's what they used to do at Ellis Island. You want to, test people, that's one thing, but don't shut down migration. Let's think about safe ways to migrate and safe ways to travel rather than to make everybody stay at home. That's not, you have to think about safe ways to interact with each other. So my website, Eon, Vox, there's also a website called openborders.info. Run by a number of activists. I believe I have a couple articles on there as well. And then there are other discussions. If you Google open borders in my name, they're pretty easy to find.
Super. I was thinking that maybe we could link to some of your stuff